let's do the change the date. Let's just chat about change the date a bit.
Okay.
So for those who don't know, there was a Decide the Date initiative that started earlier, maybe even at the end of last year, bipartisan effort to essentially get enough signatures to put this issue on a ballot to have a countywide referendum on whether or not we move the election from March to November, from the off-cycle election into the general election cycle. There are arguments for and against. The for moving the election is almost all centered around increasing voter turnout and reducing the cost on the city for running an off-cycle election. And the argument against is you bring in, you make the local issues harder to compete against the national issues. Maybe you bring in a larger voter base that maybe is not as tuned into what's going on the local level. And you make it more difficult for people in those elections to compete. They have to raise more money. They get less notoriety being part of a larger election cycle, other topics, etc. Where I draw the line, or where I start to kind of see who and how might want this thing to go through, is that I see the pro-growth, development people saying, yes, let's move the election. And I see the let's hold on to slow growth, small Sarasota saying, let's keep the election in March, which in my mind means, okay, one side wants to open up and be able to have and make some changes in the city and be able to operate, whereas one likes the fact that there's a very small voter base that controls those decisions. Right? And so that's where I think this, and nobody's talking about that. You won't find it in any of the other publications. What I just said.
I read all these articles.
This comes down to, does Sarasota grow, and do we start finding ways to change density laws and actually create real economic stimulus by kind of releasing some of these restrictions and allow some of that to come into the city, or do we not? And that's where I think that's the underbelly of this debate that nobody's actually having. And I have a hard time validating anybody who would be against this who might also be for a voter registration or get out the vote effort. And so it's like you see a lot of these groups who work to increase voter registrations and who do big get out the vote campaigns, even for the local elections, and presumably their intent is to get more people to turn out to vote. And there is no statistical question as to whether or not moving the election to November would increase that vote. The question is, who then maintains control, who then has say. We're talking about 17 to 18% voter turnout in the local city elections when you're talking about these off-cycle elections versus 60, 70% in the national elections.
So it's a smaller body of highly involved people who wind up making a lot of the decisions, and they tend to be conservative in the sense of keeping things the same. And opening up those elections in the general brings in a lot more young voters. It brings in a lot more, a much broader demographic spectrum across every dimension of demographics.
Yeah.
So it's much more likely to bring about change.
Right.
So yeah, that's a very interesting way of thinking about it.
And you've got this very tiny Democratic-controlled city that sits in a very broad Republican county.
That's right.
And so again, anyone who dresses this argument as anything other than that is not telling you the full story.
That's right.
You only heard it here.
Yeah. No, genius.